There is a kind of silence that follows a man who has been forgotten by the world. Not the peaceful silence of a Sunday morning or the comfortable quiet of a house at rest. This silence has weight. It presses against the walls. It sits across the table from you at breakfast and says nothing because there is nothing left to say. Dale Mercer knew that silence better than he knew his own reflection. He was 55 years old and he lived in a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Harlow, Wisconsin, a town of 3,000 people set in the flat farm country where the interstate didn't bother to stop. The apartment was clean. Dale had always kept things clean. But clean and livable are two different things, and somewhere in the last 6 months the apartment had stopped being a place where a man lived and had become a place where a man waited. Waited for the phone to ring. Waited for an email that didn't begin with the words "we regret to inform you." Waited for something, anything to remind him that his presence on this earth still registered somewhere. The kitchen table had 4 legs and 1 chair. He'd sold the other 3 chairs in January when the heating bill arrived and his bank account gave him a choice between warmth and furniture. He'd chosen warmth. He told himself it didn't matter. He ate alone anyway. 25 years. That's how long Dale had worked at Midland Distribution Center on the south edge of Harlow. Loading docks and inventory systems, forklift certifications, and shipping manifests the specific satisfaction of a warehouse running smooth and on time. He hadn't loved the work the way some men love their careers, but he'd been good at it, and being good at something honest felt like enough. It felt like a life. Then the company moved operations to Tennessee, shook his hand, handed him a severance check that lasted 3 months, and mailed him a form letter thanking him for his service. 25 years, and the letter didn't even use his name. It said, "Dear valued employee," like he was a category rather than a person. That was 6 months ago. Since then, Dale had applied to 42 jobs. He kept the count in a spiral notebook, each rejection dated and noted in his careful handwriting. Warehouse supervisor positions went to men 15 years younger. Logistics coordinator roles required software certifications he didn't have. Entry-level stock positions, the kind of work he could do in his sleep, sent polite replies explaining they were looking for candidates who fit their long-term growth vision. At 55, apparently, he didn't fit anyone's vision of the future. His daughter Nora called less and less. She was 32 and worked in pharmaceutical sales 3 hours away in Madison, a city that moved at a speed Harlow couldn't match. She was bright and driven and successful, and Dale was proud of her in the deep, unspoken way that fathers carry pride like something too fragile to set down. He'd raised her alone after her mother died, worked double shifts to cover her college tuition, watched her walk across that graduation stage, and felt something in his chest open up like a window in spring. But the calls had thinned. Sunday evenings became every other Sunday. Every other Sunday became whenever she remembered. Lately, she remembered about once a month, and when she did call, the conversations felt like status reports rather than conversations. She was busy. He understood. He told himself he understood. The apartment was very quiet in the evenings. The county fair had been running for 91 years, held every September in the field behind Harlow High School. Dale went because going somewhere was better than staying in that apartment with its 1 chair and its pressing silence. He walked past the craft booths and the 4-H displays, watched families move through the lights and noise like they belonged to a world he'd been quietly edged out of, and felt the steady invisibility of a man who has no role to play in the scene around him. Near the volunteer fire department booth, a man named Gordon Hicks was selling raffle tickets. Gordon had worked at Midland too, retired 4 years back with a pension in the easy manner of a man who'd made his peace with time. He waved Dale over with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of someone who genuinely liked people. "Dollar a ticket, gee. 5 for $5, Gordon said, gesturing at the prize board. "Got some good stuff this year." Pete Holman donated a new generator. Marie Soderberg putting up one of her quilts. And the county's offering the old Pruitt place out on rural Route 9. Dale looked at the board. The farm was listed as the grand prize, which sounded generous until you knew anything about it. Harlan Pruitt had died in December of 2019, and the property had passed to the county when no heirs came forward. The house was falling in on itself. The barn listed to one side. The fields had gone wild with 5 years of unmanaged growth. Dale had driven past it once or twice on his way to the hardware store. It looked like a place where something had given up a long time ago and never looked back. $5, Dale heard himself say. He pulled a crumpled bill from his wallet. Gordon handed him 5 tickets, printed in faded blue ink, wished him luck, and Dale walked away already forgetting about it. He didn't believe in luck. Luck was for people who still thought the universe was paying attention. The drawing happened at 6 o'clock after the pie judging and before the fireworks. Dale hadn't planned to stay that long, but inertia is a powerful force when a man has nowhere particular to be, and he found himself sitting on a bench near the parking lot as the sky turned the color of old copper and the announcer's voice crackled through the speakers. And the grand prize winner is ticket number 38471, Dale Mercer. The name didn't register at first, then it did. Dale looked down at the tickets in his hand with fingers that felt suddenly clumsy. The last ticket matched. He'd won. The walk to the main tent felt longer than it should have. People turned to look as he approached the stage. The announcer, a round man named Jerry Stokes, who ran the feed store, grinned with the performed enthusiasm of someone who knew this was good theater. Dale Mercer, come on up here. There was applause. Underneath it, Dale heard something else. Laughter in pockets. Whispers moving through the crowd like a current. Someone near the back said, "Poor bastard," loud enough to carry, and someone else laughed in response. The kind of laugh that means, "I'm glad that isn't me." Jerry handed him a manila envelope and shook his hand with theatrical warmth. "Congratulations," he said. "You're now the proud owner of the old Pruitt place. 40 acres house barn, the whole works." More applause. More whispers. Dale thanked Jerry, took the envelope, and walked off the stage. As he passed through the crowd, he caught fragments of conversation. "Roof's probably caved in. That whole property is a money pit. Pruitt was always strange. Place has been cursed since he died." Dale didn't look back. He walked to his car, got in, and sat in the dark parking lot while the fairgrounds emptied and the fireworks painted the sky in colors that felt like they belonged to someone else's celebration entirely. He sat there for a long time, turning the keys over in his hand. A plain key ring with 3 keys and a small paper tag that said Pruitt Route 9. He could sell it, if anyone would buy it, or he could keep the keys. He drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat and the silence louder than it had been in weeks. The next morning, Dale drove out to rural Route 9. The driveway had nearly disappeared under 5 years of growth saplings and tall weeds pressing in from both sides and scraping against his car like they were trying to push him back. The house appeared gradually through the overgrowth, a 2-story farmhouse with paint peeling in long, curling strips. Shutters hanging at wrong angles, a front porch that sagged in the middle like a man carrying too much weight for too long. The barn stood 50 yards back, listing to the south, its weathered boards, silver gray in the morning light. Beyond it, the field stretched out toward tree lines on all sides, completely overtaken a sea of tall grass and volunteer growth, and the wildness of land that has been left entirely to its own business. Dale parked and got out. The silence here was different from the silence in his apartment. It had texture, wind moving through tall grass, a crow stating its opinion somewhere in the distance, the creaking of the barn's roof in a breeze that barely moved the air. It was the silence of a place that had been waiting, not the silence of a place that had given up. He tested the front porch steps. They held. He used the first key on the ring to unlock the front door, and it swung inward with a sound like a long exhale. Inside, dust covered everything. The furniture was still there, which startled him more than the dust. A sofa with sunken cushions, a kitchen table with 4 chairs pushed in, a stone fireplace with ash still in the grate. It looked less like an abandoned house and more like a house whose owner had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. Dale moved through the room slowly. He was looking for damage, for the kind of structural failure that would tell him this was unsalvageable. What he found instead was neglect. Serious years, deep neglect, but not ruin. The bones of the place were sound. His wife had always used that phrase. Good bones. She'd been able to walk into a failing house and see past the surface damage to what was underneath, to what the structure was actually capable of becoming. Standing in Harlan Pruitt's kitchen with morning light coming through dirty windows, Dale felt something of that same instinct stir in him. The place needed work. Everything needed work. But it was fixable. He opened drawers, checking for water damage, for signs of pest activity. In the drawer nearest the sink, he found a photograph. It was black and white, curled at the edges. A man in what looked like his late 60s, standing beside some kind of machine, one hand resting on a copper component the size of a basketball. The man had a quality in his expression that Dale couldn't immediately name, something in the set of his jaw and the slight curve at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile. It was the face of a man who knew something that the camera and everyone looking at it did not. Dale turned the photograph over. On the back in pencil, someone had written H. Pruitt, 2018. This was the man who'd owned this place, who'd lived here alone for however many years, who died here in December 2019 with no family to come forward and no one to carry his things out. Dale studied the face for a long moment, then slipped the photograph into his shirt pocket. He spent the rest of that first morning cleaning. Not organizing, not planning, just cleaning the way a man attacks a problem when thinking about it hasn't helped. He scrubbed the kitchen counter, swept floors room by room, wiped windows until light came through them properly. By noon, the house felt less like an abandoned place and more like a place that had been waiting for someone to remember it. He went back to his apartment, packed everything he owned into the back of his 12-year-old sedan, in 2 trips turned in his key to the landlord and moved into the Pruitt farmhouse on a Thursday. His entire life fit into 4 boxes of duffel bag and the knowledge that his apartment lease had expired and he had nowhere else to go. He stood in the living room of the farmhouse with his boxes around him, looked at the space where Harlan Pruitt's furniture still stood, and felt something he hadn't expected. Not dread, not the grief of a man arriving at rock bottom. Something quieter than that. Something that felt distantly like possibility. He slept on an air mattress the first night. The house talked around him. The creak of old wood settling wind, finding gaps in the siding. The voice of a structure that has stood a long time and has things to say about it. Dale lay on his back in the upstairs bedroom and listened to those sounds and found them oddly comforting. Better company, if he was honest with himself, than the muffled noise of neighbors he'd never met through apartment walls he'd never bothered to decorate. In the morning, he started exploring in earnest. The second bedroom was smaller than the one he'd slept in, painted a faded yellow that had probably been cheerful once. Empty except for a wooden desk pushed against the wall beneath the window. Dale opened the desk drawers one by one, checking for damage. The first 2 were empty. The third stuck, and when he worked it free, he found a leather-bound journal wedged at an angle as though it had been pushed in quickly or perhaps fallen from a shelf and landed there. The leather was soft and worn with handling. Someone had held this book many times over many years. Dale carried it downstairs to the kitchen, where the light was better, poured himself coffee from the pot he'd brought, and sat down at Harlan Pruitt's kitchen table. He opened to the first page. The handwriting was precise and careful. Each letter fully formed the writing of a man who took small things seriously. The first entry was dated March 15, 1995. Started today on what might be the most important work of my life. They'll say I'm crazy. They already do. But I know this can work. The mathematics are sound. The principles are solid. What I lack in formal credentials, I make up for in stubbornness and time. Plenty of both. Dale turned pages. The entries spanned years, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes separated by months. Harlan wrote about his work with the precision of a man who understood what he was doing, dense with equations and component references and diagrams sketched in the margins. But between the technical passages was something else. A voice. A man thinking out loud, talking to himself, talking to whoever might someday read these pages. One entry from September 2003 stopped Dale entirely. Went to town today for supplies. Charlie at the hardware store gave me that look again, the one that says he's already decided I'm wasting my time. Maybe I am, but when you've been looked at that way your whole life, you learn to use it as fuel. They looked at me that way in school. They looked at me that way when I told them I could fix anything. They're looking at me that way now. Let them. I'll keep working. Dale read those words twice. He sat with them the way you sit with something that has landed somewhere tender and unexpectedly true. He knew that look. He'd seen it at the county fair when they called his name. He'd heard it in the laughter that followed him off the stage. He'd felt it in every form letter that began "Dear Valued Employee" and ended with nothing. He kept reading. One entry, brief from 2001, Sarah said, "I care more about machines than people." Maybe she's right. Machines don't leave. Dale set the journal down for a moment and looked out the kitchen window at the barn standing gray and crooked against the morning sky. He thought about the photograph in his shirt pocket, the man with the quiet, knowing expression, the slight curl at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile. Harlan Pruitt had lived his entire adult life in this house, working on something he believed in, surrounded by people who'd already decided he was wrong. And somewhere in those 30 years of work, the one person who might have stayed had left instead. Dale picked the journal back up. The later entries grew more focused. Harlan wrote about something he called the converter. Tests and prototypes and failures and adjustments. Small breakthroughs recorded with restrained satisfaction, as though he didn't want to celebrate too early. The entries in the final years grew more urgent, more tired, the handwriting slightly looser, the sentences shorter, a man writing against time he could feel running. The last entry was dated November 12th, 2019. Harlan Pruitt would be dead within the month. So tired now. The work is nearly done, but I'm running out of time. Can feel it in my bones the way you feel winter when you've lived through enough of them. If I don't finish, someone else will have to. The plans are all here. The pieces are all here. Just need someone who believes enough to put them together. That's all any of us need, really. Someone who believes. Dale closed the journal carefully, the way you close something that deserves that care. His coffee had gone cold without him noticing. He looked around the kitchen, and he saw it differently now. This wasn't just an abandoned house that a county fair had seen fit to give away to a man with nowhere better to be. This was Harlan Pruitt's home. His workshop was here somewhere, and in it, the work of a man's entire life was waiting in the dark. Dale stood, picked up the journal, and walked out toward the barn. The barn's main doors were secured with a padlock caked in rust. The third key on the ring fitted, and after considerable effort, the lock gave way, and Dale pulled the doors open wide. Afternoon light fell into the darkness in a long, bright wedge. The space was larger than it appeared from outside. Concrete floor cracked but solid. Old hay bales stacked along one wall with the patience of things that have been waiting a long time. A tractor in the far corner under a canvas tarp, tires flat. Tools hanging on pegboards, their shapes visible beneath years of accumulated cobwebs. Dale walked the perimeter slowly. He tested the floor, checked the roof structure, ran his hand along the pegboard tools. Everything here was organized. Even under the dust, the logic of the arrangement was clear. Harlan Pruitt had been a methodical man, a man who knew where everything was and why it was there. At the back of the barn, behind a wall of hay bales that had been stacked with a deliberateness that felt different from the rest, Dale noticed something. The bales were too carefully placed, not the way you stack hay for storage, the way you stack it to fill a space you want to look like storage. He moved bales aside one by one, and behind them was a door. This one was secured with a newer padlock recently installed compared to everything else in the barn. None of the keys on the ring fitted. Dale looked around the barn, found a heavy pipe wrench hanging on the pegboard, and struck the lock 4 times before it gave. The door swung open, and Dale Mercer stood at the threshold of something that knocked the breath from him. The workshop was immaculate, not in the way of a room that had been clean, but in the way of a room that had been cared for by someone who understood that the space you work in is a reflection of how seriously you take the work. Workbenches lined 3 walls, their surfaces covered with tools, organized with obvious and deliberate intention. Blueprints were tacked to the walls, dozens of them, mechanical drawings and electrical schematics rendered with the precision of someone who had no formal training and therefore had to be more careful than anyone who did. The afternoon light came through a single high window and fell across everything in the warm, slanted way of late September in Wisconsin. In the center of the main workbench, on a cleared space that had clearly been prepared for it, sat a device covered with a canvas tarp. Dale approached it slowly. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way he usually wasn't. He reached out and grasped the edge of the tarp and pulled it away. The device was beautiful. That was not the word he'd expected to think, but it was the right one. Copper coils wound with extraordinary precision, hundreds of them, thousands arranged with the patience of a man who measured success in fractions of a millimeter. Metal components fitted together with craft that spoke of revision after revision until the fit was exactly right. A housing that protected the internal mechanisms without a wasted surface. A control panel with gauges and switches and connection points, each one purposeful, nothing decorative, nothing there that didn't serve the whole. It was incomplete, he could see that. Wires hung loose at several connection points. Certain sections showed obvious gaps where components had been designed for and not yet installed. The right side of the device was fully assembled. The left side told the story of work that had been interrupted by something that hadn't asked permission. But the craftsmanship of what was finished was stunning. This was the work of a man who had cared about every detail because he understood that in a machine, every detail matters to every other detail. You cannot cut corners when the corners are what hold it together. Dale stood in the workshop with the dust motes rising around him in the light and looked at the life's work of Harlan Pruitt, a man he had never met and would never meet, and felt something move through him that he couldn't immediately name. He found more blueprints rolled in metal tubes along the far wall. He carried one to an empty section of bench and unrolled it carefully. Across the top in the same precise handwriting from the journal Pruitt Energy Converter Prototype A. Below it, dense technical drawings showing how the components fit together, how energy moved through the system, what outputs could be expected. Dale didn't understand most of it. He was honest with himself about that. He understood load and balance and the logic of systems from 25 years in a warehouse, but this was engineering of a different order. What he understood was enough, though. He understood that this was real. He understood that someone had spent 30 years building something that could generate clean power from minimal input, something that could work independently, something designed specifically for communities like this one, communities that the grid had never served as well as it served the cities. He understood that Harlan Pruitt had died in December 2019, convinced that he had failed, that this workshop and everything in it would sit in the dark until the county eventually decided what to do with it, that no one in Harlow had thought to look, that no one had believed there was anything here worth looking for. Dale rolled the blueprint carefully and placed it back in its tube. He stood in the workshop for a long time, not moving, just looking at the device and the walls and the organized tools and the blueprints that represented 30 years of one man's certainty. The light from the high window was changing color as the afternoon moved toward evening. Then he made a promise. Not out loud, not in the theatrical way that promises are made in stories. He made it quietly, the way a man makes a decision when he's been thinking about it long enough that the decision simply becomes clear. He would understand this work. He would learn what Harlan Pruitt had been building and why and how. And if it was possible, if it was even remotely within his reach, he would finish it. He would not let this end in the dark. A week after Dale moved into the farmhouse on a warm Tuesday afternoon, an old Ford pickup came slowly up the driveway. It parked behind a sedan, and a woman emerged with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a body that no longer moved the way it once did. She was perhaps 80, white-haired, using a wooden cane, dressed in a cardigan despite the warmth. She looked at the house, and something crossed her face that might have been recognition or might have been grief. Possibly both. "My name is Agnes Whitfield," she said when Dale came to the porch. "I live about 2 miles down on Route 9. Thought I'd come introduce myself. See how you're settling in." Dale made coffee, and they sat at Harlan Pruitt's kitchen table, and Agnes looked around the room with eyes that remembered it differently. "I knew Harlan," she said after a while. 30 years. Not close the way neighbors aren't always close out here. But we knew each other. My husband, Carl, helped him sometimes with metalwork. Harlan would come over with drawings, ask questions about how to shape certain pieces, what tools to use. What was he like? Agnes considered this with the care of someone who had thought about it before and wanted to get it right. "Brilliant," she said, "and kind in the way of people who've been alone long enough to know what kindness costs. Terribly lonely, I think, though he never complained. People in town thought he was strange. Maybe he was. But strange isn't the same as bad. He was just focused on something the rest of us couldn't see." "His work," Dale said. "Yes, he talked about it sometimes, making something that could help people, something that would prove he'd done something worthwhile with his life." She looked at Dale steadily across the table. The look of a woman who had lived long enough to see through what people say to what they mean. "You found his workshop, didn't you?" It was not a question. Dale nodded. "Are you going to finish what he started?" The question sat between them in the afternoon light. Dale thought about the device on the workbench, the way it had looked when he pulled the canvas away. The way it had looked like something that was waiting rather than something that was abandoned. "I'm trying to understand it first," he said. "Whether I can finish it, I don't know yet." Agnes smiled. A real smile, not the polite kind. "Carl's old workshop is in our barn, tools, equipment, some specialized things he collected over 40 years. Come ask if you need anything." Harlan helped Carl more times than I can count. Least I can do is help someone helping him. She paused, turning her coffee cup slowly between her palms, and added, "If it ever comes to needing legal advice about any of this, Carl's friend Howard Gaines lives out on the county road about 4 miles past my place. Retired attorney, spent 40 years in corporate law, and has strong feelings about institutions that treat people unfairly. He's the kind of man who still gets angry about the right things. I'll give you his number before I go." Dale nodded, filing that away. He didn't know yet why it would matter, but he wrote the number in the same spiral notebook where he'd been recording his 42 job rejections in the margin of the last page beside the last entry. It seemed right to put it there. She left in the late afternoon, moving carefully back to her truck. Dale stood on the porch and watched her go. He called Nora that evening. She answered on the fourth ring, the slightly distracted tone of a woman in the middle of something. Hey, Dad, what's going on? I wanted to let you know I moved out of the apartment. I'm at the farm now. A pause. Are you serious about this? I'm serious. Dad, this is impulsive. You should be focused on finding real work, not playing farmer. I'm not playing anything. I found something here, Nora, in the barn. Something the man who owned this place spent his whole life building. I'm going to try to understand it. A longer pause, and then more carefully, what kind of something? Something that might matter, Dale said. I don't know the full shape of it yet, but I think it's real. He heard her breathing on the other end. He heard her not saying the words he expected, which were, Dad, this is exactly what I was afraid of. What she said instead was, keep me posted. After they hung up, Dale sat in the kitchen in the dark for a long time, turning the photograph of Harlan Pruitt over in his hands, the man with the quiet, knowing expression, the slight curl at the corner of his mouth. Dale had arrived here with nothing. No job, no plan, no real sense of what the next year was supposed to look like. A worthless farm that a town had laughed at him for winning. He looked at the photograph of a man who had spent 30 years alone in a barn, working on something he believed in, surrounded by people who had already decided he was wrong. Dale set the photograph on the table in front of him, face up, so that Harlan Pruitt's quiet expression was the last thing he saw before he went to bed. Tomorrow he would go back to the workshop. He would start at the beginning with the blueprints in the journal and the organized patience of a dead man's tools. He didn't know yet what he would find. But for the first time in 6 months, for the first time since the form letter, in the empty apartment, in the 42 rejections, in the silence that pressed against everything, Dale Mercer went to sleep with something to wake up for. The house settled around him in the dark, speaking in its old wooden language, and it no longer sounded like a place that had given up. It sounded like a place that had been waiting for exactly this. There is a kind of education that happens outside of classrooms. No grades, no syllabus, no one to tell you whether you're on the right track. Just a man and a problem, and the slow accumulation of understanding that comes from refusing to quit when the problem refuses to simplify. Dale Mercer began that education on a Monday morning in October, 6 days after he'd first pulled the canvas off Harlan Pruitt's device, and he began it the only way he knew how. He started at the beginning. He photographed every blueprint on the walls of the workshop, all 43 of them. Using his phone in the gray morning light, he drove to the Harlow Public Library and printed in large copies on the library's color printer, apologizing to the librarian for the volume of pages and the time it took. He carried the prints back to the farmhouse and spread them across Harlan's kitchen table in the order he estimated they'd been drawn, judging by the evolution of the handwriting and the margin notes, the progression from exploratory to certain. Then he sat down with his coffee and began to read them the way you read a letter from someone who can no longer speak. Harlan's margin notes were the key. The blueprints themselves were technically dense, full of specifications and tolerances that Dale couldn't fully decode without reference materials. But the notes alongside them were something else entirely. They were a teacher talking to a student, a man explaining his own reasoning to himself, revising his thinking in real time, circling back to correct earlier assumptions, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has figured out where he went wrong. Dale read the notes first. He followed the logic of Harlan's thinking before he tried to follow the engineering. He built a map of the man's mind before he tried to build anything physical. Evenings belonged to the workshop. Mornings belonged to the world that still required practical engagement with money and groceries and the maintenance of a life. On the Monday of his second week at the farm, Dale drove to Kettler's Hardware on the main street of Harlow. The store occupied a building with high ceilings and exposed brick that smelled of sawdust and motor oil, and the specific kind of order that comes from a man who has spent decades knowing exactly where everything is. Norm Kettler was behind the counter, a man in his early 60s with close-cropped gray hair and the direct, unhurried manner of someone who has long since stopped trying to impress anyone. He looked up when Dale came in. Heard you're out at the Pruitt place now, Norm said. That working out? It's a project, Dale said, which was true in several directions at once. He asked about part-time work, stock deliveries, whatever needed doing. Norm studied him for a moment with the evaluating look of a man who has hired enough people to know the ones worth hiring from the ones who only think they are. You know the difference between a lag bolt and a carriage bolt? I do. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 8 to 2. Pays not great, but the discount's real. Dale started the following Monday. The work was simple and physical and satisfying in the way that simple physical work can be when your mind is occupied with something larger. He stocked shelves and helped customers and unloaded delivery trucks, and the rhythms of it were familiar enough from his warehouse years that he could do them without full attention, which left the rest of his mind free to work on the problem of Harlan Pruitt's device. The employee discount was the real point. Each paycheck allowed him to order components from the list he'd assembled by cross-referencing the blueprints with Harlan's journal. A voltage regulator 1 week, specialized wiring the following week, capacitors rated to the precise specifications Harlan had circled in red ink and marked with the word "need," the urgency of the annotation increasing in the later blueprints, as though Harlan had known he was running out of time and was marking the things that mattered most in case someone else had to finish from where he'd stopped. Gradually, the gaps in the device began to fill. The work was painstaking in a way that Dale found he didn't mind. Each connection had to be verified against the blueprint before it was made permanent. Each component had to be tested in isolation before it was integrated into the system. Harlan's journal was his guide through this process, not just for the technical specifications, but for the thinking behind them. Why this gauge of wire and not a heavier one? Why this configuration of coils rather than the more obvious arrangement? The journal explained the reasoning, and the reasoning, once understood, made the decisions feel less like guesswork and more like conversation with a man who was no longer there, but had been thorough enough in his record-keeping that his absence felt provisional rather than final. He read the journal in the evenings at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee at his elbow, going cold while he turned pages. He was not just learning how Harlan's device worked. He was learning who Harlan Pruitt had been, and the more he learned, the more he felt the weight of what had been lost when Harlan died alone in this house, believing that 30 years of work had amounted to nothing. Harlan had grown up in Harlow, the kind of kid who takes things apart to see how they work, and more importantly, puts them back together working better than before. He'd repaired neighbors' appliances for grocery money as a teenager. He'd taught himself mechanical engineering from library books, the same library where Dale had printed his blueprints, and later from university textbooks he ordered through interlibrary loan because he couldn't afford to buy them. He'd never had formal training. He'd never had institutional backing. He'd had curiosity and stubbornness and time, and he'd made those three things stretch as far as any man could. The device he was building was designed for communities like Harlow. Rural places where the power grid worked, but never quite as well as it worked in cities where outages in winter could mean something beyond inconvenience, where the cost of electricity pressed harder on farmers and families on fixed incomes. Harlan had wanted to build something that could work independently of the grid, something clean and efficient and manufacturable at a cost that made sense for the people who needed it most. It was not an abstract engineering exercise. It was personal. It was built from the specific experience of living in a specific place and understanding what that place needed and believing that he was the person who could provide it. Dale understood that kind of believing. He'd believed something similar about his warehouse for 25 years, that showing up and doing the work with care and consistency was enough that the system would recognize and reward a man who did his job well. He'd been wrong about that too. The cabinet in the far corner of the workshop had been bothering Dale for 2 weeks. It wasn't that anything about it was obviously wrong. It was a standard metal tool cabinet. 4 drawers painted gray, the kind you'd find in any serious workshop. But the bottom drawer had always stuck slightly when he opened it, and one afternoon in late October, when he pulled it fully open and then pressed it back in, he noticed that the rear panel didn't seat flush against the frame, a gap thin and easily missed along the bottom edge. Dale knelt and pressed the panel with both hands. It moved inward slightly, then resisted. He pressed harder, and something shifted, and then the whole panel pivoted, and a metal lockbox tumbled forward and hit the concrete floor with a sound that rang through the workshop like a struck bell. The box was the size of a shoebox, heavy steel with a combination lock on the front. Dale tried Harlan's birth year. Nothing. The year he'd bought the farm. Nothing. Simple sequences. Nothing. He went back to the journal. He found it in an entry from 1997, a brief passage about calling his mother on her birthday. Harlan had written the date in full, the way of a man who kept careful track of things that mattered to him. Dale converted it to a 6-digit number, pressed the combination into the lock, and felt the mechanism release. Inside were papers, letters organized in chronological order and held in bundles with rubber bands, the rubber brittle with age but still holding. Dale carried the box to the main workbench, set it under the best light, and began to read. The first letter was dated April 2003, addressed to Dr. Evelyn Stratton at the State University School of Engineering. Harlan's letter introduced himself and his project with the careful precision of a man who understood he was addressing a skeptic and had prepared accordingly. He described the converter, laid out the principles behind it in clear and well-organized language, and asked if Dr. Stratton would be willing to review his calculations and offer her assessment. The tone was humble without being self-deprecating. It was the letter of a man who knew his work was sound and wanted expert confirmation, not validation of his ego, but verification of his engineering. Dr. Stratton's response came 2 weeks later. She was interested. She asked for more details. She offered encouragement that sounded even filtered through the formal register of academic correspondence, like genuine intellectual excitement. And so began a correspondence that Dale spent 3 hours reading, from start to finish, his coffee forgotten at his elbow, the workshop growing cold around him as the afternoon gave way to evening. The letter showed a collaboration developing over 4 years. Dr. Stratton provided feedback on Harlan's designs, suggested refinements helped him understand complex principles that his self-teaching had covered imperfectly. She was generous with her knowledge and clearly engaged by the novelty of what Harlan was attempting. The letters on both sides had the energy of two people who have found each other across a gap that most people would have considered uncrossable: a self-taught rural mechanic and a credentialed university engineer, finding common ground in a shared problem and building something from it. Dale watched the device evolve through the correspondence. He could see Harlan's thinking sharpening, his designs becoming more precise, his confidence in the underlying principles deepening as someone with formal training confirmed what his intuition had already told him. Then the tone shifted. A letter from Harlan dated March 2007 described his preparation to file a formal patent application. He had documented everything. The working prototype was nearly complete. He was ready to formalize his claim on what he'd built. The letter to Dr. Stratton was excited in the restrained way of a man who doesn't celebrate until the thing is done, but excited nonetheless. This was the moment Harlan had been working toward for 12 years. Dr. Stratton's response was warm and encouraging. She offered to review the application. She offered to provide documentation from their correspondence to support his claim of independent development. She sounded like a person who was genuinely happy for him. The next letter in the stack was not from Dr. Stratton. It was from the Office of Legal Affairs, State University, dated September 2007. The language was dense and bureaucratic and careful in the way of language that has been written by lawyers to accomplish something specific while appearing to accomplish something neutral. Dale read it twice, and both times his stomach tightened on the way through. The letter informed Harlan that his proposed patent application covered technology substantially similar to research being conducted within the university's Department of Energy Systems Engineering. It suggested that his application might constitute infringement on intellectual property developed through university-funded programs. It strongly advised him to seek independent legal counsel before proceeding. There were 3 patent rejection letters after that, each citing different technical grounds, but arriving at the same conclusion: application denied. Then a letter from Dr. Evelyn Stratton dated January 2008. Brief, 3 paragraphs. She had been instructed by her department to cease all correspondence with outside inventors. Her research was classified as university intellectual property. She could not provide documentation supporting Harlan's patent claim. She wished him well. She was sorry she couldn't do more. Dale set that letter down on the workbench. He reached for the next bundle, held together with a rubber band that crumbled to dust when he touched it. 3 letters are all from the same sender. Dr. Clifford, Vance Department, Head Energy Systems Engineering, State University. The first was dated March 2008, the second June 2008, the third September 2008. Dale read them in order. They were written in the register of professional courtesy, the language of a man who understood how to deliver a threat in the grammar of advice. Each letter expressed concern for Harlan's situation. Each letter explained with apparent sympathy the complex landscape of intellectual property law. Each letter warned with increasing directness that should Harlan persist in his patent claim, the university would have no choice but to pursue legal action to protect its own intellectual property, which had been developed. Dr. Vance's letters were careful to explain entirely independently and through the university's own funded research programs. The third letter was the most direct. It suggested that Harlan's claim lacked the kind of institutional documentation and legal infrastructure that successful patent challenges required. It noted that litigation of this nature could be extraordinarily costly. It expressed in the manner of a man who knows exactly what he is expressing and exactly how much he can deny having expressed it, that it might be in Harlan's best interest to allow the matter to rest. Dr. Clifford Vance had known exactly what he was doing. He knew Harlan Pruitt had no money for lawyers. He knew that without documentation of institutional backing, Harlan's word against a university's filing would go nowhere. He knew that a self-taught mechanic in a rural Wisconsin farmhouse had no leverage, no platform, no recourse. He had looked at a man with no ability to fight back and sent him 3 letters explaining with professional warmth precisely why fighting would be pointless. Dale placed the 3 letters from Dr. Vance on the workbench in a row and looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at the bottom of the last letter from Dr. Stratton, the January 2008 one, the brief apologetic one that had ended the correspondence. At the very bottom of the page, beneath the signature in a handwriting that was different from the typewritten body of the letter, cramped and hurried, as though written quickly added after the fact in a private moment, the 3 words that Harlan Pruitt had pressed into the paper hard enough to leave an impression on the page beneath. They stole it. Dale sat on the workshop stool in the gathering dark and did not move for a long time. He pulled out his phone and opened the university's website. The Department of Energy Systems Engineering had a prominent section on research accomplishments, sustainable power generation breakthrough innovations in renewable technology. The language used to describe their flagship research sounded remarkably familiar to a man who had spent weeks reading Harlan Pruitt's journals and blueprints. He found Dr. Evelyn Stratton's faculty page. Full professor, numerous publications in energy systems design, grant funding totaling several $1,000,000 over her career. Awards for innovation. A biographical note describing her as a pioneer in practical, sustainable power solutions for underserved communities. He found the university's patent portfolio. 3 patents related to energy generation systems filed between 2008 and 2010, the year after Harlan had been turned away. The technical descriptions were dense and written to obscure rather than illuminate the way patent language usually is. But Dale had spent enough time with Harlan's blueprints to recognize the bones of the thing underneath the bureaucratic translation. The patents listed multiple inventors. Dr. Stratton was among them. So was Dr. Clifford Vance. Dale set his phone face down on the workbench. Outside the workshop, the wind had picked up across the fields, moving through the tall grass with a sound like running water. He could hear it through the workshop's single window, that autumn sound of Wisconsin beginning to mean what it said. He thought about Harlan's last journal entry. November 12, 2019. So tired now. The work is nearly done, but I'm running out of time. The man had died a month later, believing he had failed. Believing his work would sit in the dark of this workshop until it rotted. Believing that 30 years of careful, serious, brilliant work had produced nothing but a device that no one would ever see, and a reputation in town as the strange man who wasted his life on an impossible dream. He had never known that his work had succeeded. Just not in his name. Dale stood and walked to the workshop door and looked out at the farm in the last of the evening light. The field stretched dark to the tree lines. The farmhouse windows were lit from inside, warm against the October cold. The place that had been a cruel joke 6 weeks ago, the worthless prize that an entire county fair had laughed at him for winning. He thought about Vance's letters, the calculated patience of them, the professional courtesy deployed in service of something that had nothing professional about it. The certainty that Harlan Pruitt would fold, because men like Harlan Pruitt always folded, because they had no choice, because the game was arranged so that they couldn't win. Dale went back inside. He sat at the workbench with his laptop and spent 2 hours researching intellectual property law, patent challenges, prior art claims, independent inventor protections. The reading was dense and in places discouraging. The resources required to pursue a case like this were substantial. The burden of proof for challenging an existing patent was high. The university would have a legal team. Dale had a farmhouse table and a box of letters. But he had the letters, he had the journals. He had the blueprints dated 1995, 12 years before the university filed their first patent. He had a correspondence that documented exactly what Harlan had shared with whom and when. And somewhere beneath all of it, he had the device itself, which was more than theory and more than drawings. He drafted an email to Dr. Evelyn Stratton at 11:30 that night. He kept it factual and plain. He explained that he had acquired Harlan Pruitt's farm through the county Raffle, found the workshop and the device and the complete correspondence. He said he had nearly completed the prototype and that his testing indicated it performed exactly as Harlan had designed it. He asked if she would be willing to speak with him about Harlan's contributions to energy research. He read the email 4 times before sending it. Then he sent it and sat in the kitchen with the lights off for a while, listening to the house settle, thinking about what a man is owed for the work he does in the world. The response came the next afternoon while Dale was stocking shelves at Norm's hardware store. He felt his phone vibrate in his pocket during a lull between customers and stepped to the back of the store to read it. Dr. Stratton's message was 7 lines. She asked if they could speak by phone. She provided her cell number. She said she had been carrying guilt about Harlan Pruitt for 15 years and that she would be grateful for the chance to speak with someone who knew what he had built. Dale called her that evening from the farmhouse porch, watching the stars appear over the dark fields. In the sequence, they always appeared, the early ones first and then the rest following, as the sky fully committed to night. She answered on the second ring. "I think about him often," she said. Her voice carried the weight of something long held. The work we did together in those letters, those were some of the most intellectually alive exchanges of my career. Harlan had an intuitive grasp of energy systems that most formally trained engineers never develop. He saw the whole picture and the details simultaneously. "It's a rare thing." "What happened?" Dale said. "Clifford Vance happened." She said the name the way you say something that has cost you considerably and is still costing you. "He was my department head. Ambitious. Always looking for the next grant, the next publication that would build the program's reputation." I mentioned Harlan's work in a faculty meeting, described some of his key innovations. I thought Clifford would want to help, perhaps bring Harlan in as a consultant, give him some form of official connection to the university's work. Instead, he asked to see the correspondence. Dale listened without interrupting. He saw money, she continued. Grant funding, commercial applications. He started talking about patents before we'd finished the conversation. I told him these were Harlan's ideas, that we had an ethical obligation to credit him properly, to involve him formally. Clifford said Harlan had no credentials, no institutional backing, no way to prove independent development if it ever came to a legal question. He said if we didn't move on it, someone else would, and at least we'd use it responsibly. Did you believe that? A pause, long enough to be its own answer. I told myself I did. I told myself I was being practical, that this was how the academic world worked, that Harlan would never be able to navigate the patent process anyway, that the technology would reach more people through us than through him. I rationalized it until I couldn't see it clearly anymore. And when Harlan tried to file his own patent, I was instructed not to respond to his correspondence. When he reached out after the rejections, I was told any contact would be a violation of university policy. I should have fought harder. I should have done something other than send that last letter and hope he'd understand things I didn't have the courage to say directly. The fields were very dark around Dale, the stars very bright above them. Vance's letters to Harlan, Dale said, the ones threatening legal action if he kept pursuing his claim. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't know about those until later. When I found out, I went to Clifford's office and told him what I thought of it. He explained to me calmly and thoroughly that I had no standing to object, that my own publications and grant applications were built on research that had been developed with that correspondence as its foundation, and that any challenge I raised would implicate me as fully as it implicated him. She paused again. He was right. I had made myself complicit at every step, and by the time I understood what I had done enough of it that I couldn't pull one thread without unraveling my entire career. Dale said nothing for a moment, looking at the stars. I've completed the device, he said finally. It works exactly as Harlan designed it. The silence on the other end was different from the silences before it. Longer, heavier, something shifting in it. Then Dr. Stratton said, "Tell me what you need from me." They talked for another hour. She had documentation, emails from 2007 and 2008, meeting notes where Harlan's designs were discussed by name, internal memos planning the patent strategy. She had kept all of it, she said, perhaps because some part of her had always known this accounting would come. She would compile everything and send it through secure channels. She would speak to colleagues who valued academic integrity over institutional loyalty. She would testify publicly if it came to that. They will fight back hard, she warned before they hung up. Clifford retired 2 years ago, but his reputation is still the department's foundation. The grants, the publications, the named professorships, all of it sits on top of what we built from Harlan's work. Acknowledging the truth doesn't just embarrass them, it calls everything into question. I understand that Dale said, "Do you understand what they'll do to you? You're a man without legal resources, without institutional standing. They will attempt to bury you the same way they buried Harlan." Dale looked out at the dark fields, at the barn where Harlan's workshop waited with its blueprints and its journals and its nearly completed device. He thought about the form letter, "Dear valued employee." He thought about 42 rejections. He thought about the laughter at the county fair. "They stole 30 years from him," Dale said, "and they let him die thinking he'd wasted them. I've got nothing they can take that matters more than that." After they hung up, Dale stayed on the porch until the cold drove him inside. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the same chair, where he'd first read Harlan's journal and tried to map the scale of what he was taking on. He was a 55-year-old unemployed warehouse worker, with no legal training, no institutional connections, no money for litigation, and no platform from which to make a credible accusation against a state university. He had a box of old letters, a set of blueprints, a journal, and a device that didn't exist as far as the rest of the world was concerned. He also had the truth, and he'd learned from Harlan Pruitt's life, from the careful record of it preserved in those journals, that the truth had a way of persisting even when powerful people worked hard to bury it. It had persisted in this workshop for 5 years, waiting for someone to find it. It could persist a little longer. He called Howard Gaines the next morning. Howard was 72, a retired corporate attorney who lived 4 miles down the county road the man Agnes had mentioned in their first conversation, the one she'd said still got angry about the right things. Dale drove to Howard's house with the lockbox and the journals and the printed copies of the blueprints, and he laid it all out on Howard's kitchen table and told the whole story from the beginning. Howard read the letters from Vance without speaking. His expression was not the expression of a man who is surprised. It was the expression of a man who is recognizing something he has seen in other forms many times before and has strong feelings about each time. "Classic," Howard said finally. "They identified someone who had no resources to fight back, and they moved on what he had, knowing exactly what they were doing." The legal threat letters are particularly ugly. Those aren't the work of a legal department covering institutional risk. Those are a department head using the university's legal authority as a personal weapon against a man who couldn't afford to respond. He looked up at Dale. "The correspondence predates their filings by years." "By at least 4, Dale said. "And you have the device itself working built to the original specifications. I can demonstrate it any time." Howard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This is winnable, not easy, not quick. But the evidence is real and the story is clear. What they did to this man was wrong in a way that can be demonstrated in a courtroom, and more importantly for our purposes, in a way that can be demonstrated publicly." Dale nodded. That was the word that had been forming in his mind all week, publicly. Whatever they could build legally would take time and money they didn't fully have. But the truth about what Dr. Clifford Vance had done to Harlan Pruitt was not a complicated truth. It could be understood by anyone who read the letters in the right order. And Dale had spent enough time in Harlow to know that in a small town, the right story told to the right people could move faster than any legal filing. He had an idea forming. It was not a sophisticated idea. It was the kind of idea a warehouse worker from Harlow, Wisconsin comes up with when the complicated approaches have already been foreclosed by circumstance. It was simple and direct, and it would either work or it wouldn't. He would show everyone what Harlan had built. 3 nights later, Dale went back to the workshop after dinner. He reviewed the startup procedures one more time, cross-referencing every step against the final blueprint and the last technical entries in the journal. He checked every connection he'd made over the preceding weeks, verified tolerances, confirmed that the components he'd installed matched the specifications exactly. Then he sat down on the stool in front of the main control panel and looked at the device for a long moment. Harlan Pruitt had sat in this workshop for 30 years. Had worked through failures and revisions in the specific solitude of a man who believes in something that no one around him can see. Had written in his journal about loneliness and stubbornness and the slow accumulation of understanding that is the only real path to something genuinely new. Had in the end run out of time before he could show anyone what he'd made. Dale reached out and flipped the main power switch. The device came to life with a sound that started low and built gradually a hum that seemed to come from the copper coils themselves as they began their measured rotation. The movement was barely visible at first, then steadier. Gauges on the control panel flickered and found their positions. Numbers appeared on the display he'd connected, following Harlan's final specifications. Voltage climbing, amperage stabilizing, frequency holding at the value Harlan had predicted in the margin of the fourth blueprint from the left, written in pencil in 2003 and never revised because he'd gotten it right the first time. The system stabilized. Dale checked the output meter. The device was generating power. Clean, consistent, measurable power from minimal input. The conversion ratio was not something he had seen in any commercial system, not in the research he'd done, not in anything he'd read. The numbers on the display were exactly the numbers in Harlan's projections, the ones that the journal described as conservative estimates numbers Harlan had actually believed were understating what the device would do. It worked, after everything. After 30 years of a man's life, after the workshop in the dark, in the letters, in the stolen patents, in the quiet death of a man who believed he'd failed. After 6 weeks of a warehouse worker with no engineering training, in a box of old letters, in a promise made to a dead man he'd never met. It worked. Dale sat on the stool in Harlan Pruitt's workshop and watched the gauges hold steady and did not move for a long time. The hum of the device filled the space around him, warm and constant, the sound of something functioning exactly as it was designed to function. He thought about Harlan writing in his journal at the kitchen table on November nights, the fields outside going dark, the workshop waiting the end, coming in a way he could feel in his bones. So tired now, just needs someone who believes enough to put it together. Dale had not known Harlan Pruitt, had never shaken his hand or heard his voice or sat across from him at a table. But he understood him the way you understand someone whose work you have held in your hands and studied for weeks, whose failures and revisions and small victories you have followed through the evidence they left behind. He understood the specific loneliness of a man who knows he is right and cannot make anyone see it. He understood the cost of that kind of persistence. He stayed in the workshop for an hour, monitoring every system, taking measurements, documenting everything with his phone because documentation was now the most important thing he had. The performance was consistent throughout. No fluctuation, no signs of stress. The engineering was sound in every dimension. When he finally shut the system down, he sat in the silence of the workshop and looked at the device for a while longer. Then he picked up his phone and called Nora. She answered on the second ring. "It works," Dale said. "I turned it on tonight and it works exactly the way he said it would." A pause, then quietly, "Dad, 30 years he worked on this. Alone. And they took it from him and let him die thinking it was for nothing. But it works, Nora. The man was right the whole time." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing that. Then, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to show people," Dale said. "I'm going to show everyone what Harlan Pruitt built before anyone can bury it again." Another pause, longer. "I'll come this weekend," Nora said. "I want to see it." Dale looked at the device on the workbench, at the blueprints on the walls at the workshop that had been waiting in the dark for 5 years. "Come see it," he said. "It's worth seeing." He locked the workshop door and walked back through the October night to the farmhouse. Above him, the stars were very clear. The kind of clear you only get in flat country with no city lights to wash them out. He stood in the yard for a moment, looking up at them. 3 days later, the letter arrived. It was from the Office of Legal Affairs, State University. Formal letterhead, dense professional language. A paragraph noting that the university had become aware of Dale's activities at the Pruitt property. A paragraph describing the university's patent portfolio in the relevant technology area. A paragraph explaining that any demonstration or commercial application of a device substantially similar to protected university intellectual property would constitute infringement and would be met with legal action up to and including injunction and civil suit. Dale read it standing at the kitchen table. He read it through twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the lockbox alongside Harlan's letters from Clifford Vance, the ones that had said the same thing to a different man in a different decade in the same professional language deployed in service of the same purpose. He closed the box. He went to the workshop. He started making calls about the demonstration. There is a moment in the life of any true thing when it stops being private. When the work that has lived in the dark of a single mind or a single workshop or a single man's stubbornness steps into the light and becomes available to the judgment of the world. That moment cannot be controlled or rehearsed. It can only be prepared for and then met with whatever you have. Dale Mercer spent the 2 weeks before the demonstration preparing with the focused calm of a man who has already done the harder work and knows it. The physical preparations were straightforward. He cleaned the workshop until it no longer looked like a place that had been waiting and instead looked like a place that was ready. He mounted enlarged copies of the key blueprints on the walls in the order of their development so that anyone walking through could follow the arc of Harlan Pruitt's thinking across 30 years. He positioned the device at the center of the main workbench where it could be seen clearly from the doorway, the copper coils catching whatever light came through the high window and returning it with a warmth that felt in certain angles of the afternoon almost like intention. He set up folding chairs outside the workshop entrance, borrowed from the Harlow Community Center, with the help of Agnes Whitfield, who had made a phone call to the center's director on a Tuesday morning and had the chairs delivered by Wednesday afternoon. Agnes had a way of making things happen that Dale was coming to understand was one of the underappreciated forces of the world, the quiet competence of an 80-year-old woman who has outlasted every obstacle she has ever faced and sees no reason to start being intimidated now. Word spread through Harlow the way word spreads in small towns, which is to say faster and more thoroughly than any organized communication effort could have managed. Norm Kettler mentioned it to customers at the hardware store. Agnes told her church circle. Howard Gaines called two retired colleagues from his legal career men who still had connections to journalism and to advocacy organizations in the state capitol. By the end of the first week, Dale's phone had begun to ring with calls from people he didn't know, a reporter from the county newspaper, a blogger who covered energy technology and innovation, a woman from a public radio station in Madison who'd heard something about a self-taught inventor in a disputed patent and wanted to understand what she'd heard. Dale answered these calls briefly and redirected most of them. He was not the story. He understood that clearly. He was the person who had found the story and was now responsible for telling it correctly. The story was Harlan Pruitt, and Harlan Pruitt deserved to have his story told without Dale's circumstances getting in the way of it. He called Nora every evening during those 2 weeks. She had come the weekend after he'd first turned on the device driven 3 hours from Madison in her practical sedan and stood in the workshop doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. She had walked slowly around the device, studying it without speaking, and then she had picked up the journal from where Dale kept it on the corner of the workbench and opened it to the first page and read the first entry. She'd set the journal down and looked at her father. He was alone out here for 30 years, she said, working on this. Yes, and they took it. Yes, she'd been quiet for a while after that. Not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say, but the quiet of someone who was recalibrating something internal, revising a position they'd held without examining it closely enough. When she finally spoke, she said, "Tell me how I can help." She handled the media coordination in the days leading up to the demonstration, her pharmaceutical sales background giving her a fluency with scheduling and messaging that Dale was grateful to hand off. She drafted a one-page summary of Harlan's story and the evidence supporting it, factual and plainly written, and sent it to the reporter and the blogger and the radio producer and several others whose interest Howard Gaines had quietly cultivated. She organized the timeline of the correspondence into a document that anyone could follow without legal training or technical knowledge. She was good at it. Dale watched her work at Harlan's kitchen table in the evenings, her laptop open, her phone beside it, and felt a complicated pride that had something protective mixed into it. The feeling of a father watching his child become more fully themselves in real time. Howard Gaines had been in contact with Dr. Evelyn Stratton throughout the preparation period. She had sent the documentation she'd promised, encrypted files containing the meeting notes and internal emails and the memoranda from 2007 and 2008 that showed in the university's own words how Harlan Pruitt's designs had been discussed, appropriated, and built into a patent strategy that had then been used to shut him down. The files were devastating in the way of institutional documents that have been written without any expectation that the outside world would ever read them. Howard had also been in contact with a woman named Patricia Osgood at the National Innovation Protection Alliance, a nonprofit that had followed the case through the regional media attention it had already begun to attract. The organization offered legal support and had connections to journalists who covered intellectual property issues at the national level. Howard accepted both with the measured gratitude of a man who has learned to take help where it's offered and trust the judgment of experienced allies. Everything was in place. The night before the demonstration, Dale walked through the workshop one final time after dark, with only the work light on the main bench casting its yellow circle across the device and the blueprints and the organized tools of a man who had cared about every detail. He walked slowly, looking at each thing in turn, the journals on the shelf, the photographs he'd printed and framed the black and white image of Harlan, standing beside the early prototype with that slight knowing expression, and others he'd found in the lockbox. Harlan, at various stages of the work alone in this workshop over 3 decades, the device on the bench at different points of its development. A record of a man's life measured in the progress of a single object. He stood in front of the device for a long time. "I don't know if there is anywhere you can know this from," Dale said quietly to the empty workshop, "but I'm going to try to give you what you should have had while you were still here to feel it." He turned off the work light and locked the door and went to the farmhouse to sleep. He didn't sleep much. The demonstration was set for a Saturday in mid-November, and the morning arrived with the pale, clear quality of late autumn in Wisconsin, the kind of day that has given up on warmth without becoming hostile about it. The sky, a clean gray blue, the air carrying the particular stillness of a season that has settled into what it is. Dale was up before 5. He made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the fields lighten gradually as the dark retreated the bare ground, and the remaining tall grass going from black to gray to the muted gold brown of November in the upper Midwest. He thought about Harlan Pruitt standing at this same window on mornings like this one, looking at these same fields carrying the weight of work that no one around him could see or value. By noon, the cars started coming up the driveway. Norm Kettler arrived first, having taken the day off without being asked, showing up with 2 thermoses of coffee and the unceremonious helpfulnesses of a man who decides to do a thing and simply does it. Agnes Whitfield came with 6 members of her church circle, women in their 70s and 80s, who had known Harlow for most of a century and had known Harlan Pruitt as the quiet man at the edge of town who never caused trouble and never quite fit. They settled into the folding chairs with the quiet authority of people who understand the importance of bearing witness. The local television crew arrived at 1:30, a young reporter named Drew Calloway and a cameraman who set up with practiced efficiency, testing angles, checking light. A journalist named Beth Sherwood from the county paper had been there since noon, notebook in hand, asking Dale questions in the careful way of someone who already understands a story and is now looking for the details that will make it real for readers who don't. People Dale barely knew pulled up the long driveway in 1s and 2s in small groups. Neighbors from down rural Route 9, customers from the hardware store who had heard Norm mention it, people who had lived in Harlow for 40 years and had driven past Harlan Pruitt's farm every week of those 40 years and had never once stopped to think about what the man inside was doing. By 2 o'clock, 160 people had gathered in the yard outside the workshop. The folding chairs were filled twice over. People stood in back rows and sat on the grass and lined the side of the barn. Dale had expected perhaps 40. The turnout had a quality that went beyond curiosity. People had come because the story they'd heard in the preceding 2 weeks had gotten into them. Somehow had reached a place that a story about a strange old man and a disputed patent shouldn't logically have reached, and they hadn't been able to stay away. Nora found Dale at the workshop door at 5 minutes to 2 and gripped his arm briefly. She looked at him with steady eyes and nodded once. That was enough. Howard Gaines stood and called for attention. The crowd quieted in the way crowds quiet when they are already predisposed to listen. Dale stepped forward. He was not a practiced speaker. He had never stood in front of more than a dozen people in his professional life, and those occasions had involved inventory reports and shipping schedules, rather than anything requiring the assembly of words that could carry the weight of what he needed to say. He had not written a speech. He had decided after several failed attempts at the kitchen table in the evenings that the only way to say this was directly the way you say things to people you respect. 6 months ago, he began his voice steadier than he'd expected. "I won this farm in a raffle at the county fair. Most of you know that. Some of you were there." A ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. A few small smiles that acknowledged the story they all knew, the worthless prize, the laughter. "I didn't know what I was getting," Dale said. "Neither did anyone else. But I want to tell you what I found when I got here, because what I found is the reason you're all standing in this field today." He told the story from the beginning. He didn't embellish and he didn't simplify. He described the journal in the desk drawer and what it said about Harlan Pruitt's 30 years of work. He described the workshop behind the wall of hay bales and the device under the canvas and the quality of craftsmanship that had stopped his breath when he pulled the canvas away. He described the blueprints and the months of learning what they meant and the components ordered piece by piece on a hardware store employee's discount in the evening in October when he'd flipped the main power switch for the first time. He described the lockbox and the letters and what the letters said about what had been done to Harlan Pruitt. He told it plainly without editorial and let the facts carry their own weight, which was considerable. The crowd was very quiet by the time he finished speaking. Dale stepped aside and revealed the device where it sat on the main workbench, visible through the open workshop door. He heard the sound move through the crowd, not words exactly, just the collective response of 160 people seeing something they hadn't expected to see. He explained the principles in plain language, following the approach Harlan himself had used in the journal when explaining difficult concepts to himself, starting from what anyone already understood and building toward what they didn't. How the system captured and converted energy, how the components worked together, what the copper coils were doing, and why their precise winding mattered. He walked them through the blueprints on the walls, showed them how the design had evolved across 30 years, let them see the progression of thinking that was itself a kind of argument for how serious this work had always been. Then he powered it on. The startup sequence was the same one he'd followed 100 times in the preceding weeks. The hum began low and built. The coils began their rotation. The gauges climbed to their operating positions and steadied. The crowd leaned forward as one. Dale had connected the output to a power strip running to a space heater, 3 lights, a small refrigerator, and a power drill. He flipped the switches in sequence. The lights came on. The heater began to push warmth into the cool morning air. The refrigerator hummed to life. The drill ran in a short, clean burst. The output meter held steady. More than it consumed, efficient beyond the range of anything commercially available. The device was doing exactly what Harlan Pruitt had designed it to do in 1995 and had been doing in his calculations ever since, with adjustments and refinements along the way, but never a departure from the original principle, because the original principle had been right. Someone in the crowd said something Dale couldn't make out. Then the applause started, and it was genuine, the kind of applause that people make when they have witnessed something they didn't know was possible and are reacting before they've finished processing what they've seen. Dale let the device run. He wanted them to see it sustain. He wanted the steadiness of it to register the fact that this was not a demonstration trick, but a working system that simply continued doing what it was designed to do. It was at this point, while the gauges held their positions and the lights burned steadily, and the November air near the heater was warm, that a car Dale hadn't seen arrive pulled up at the back of the gathered crowd, and a man in a charcoal suit got out with 2 other men in dark coats and began moving through the people toward the workshop. Dr. Clifford Vance was 67 years old, broad-shouldered, with the particular confidence of a man who has spent decades being the most credentialed person in any room he entered. He moved through the crowd with the expectation of deference, and people moved aside for him automatically in the way that people respond to that kind of expectation, whether or not they consciously intend to. The man beside him carried a leather portfolio and moved with the practiced neutrality of a lawyer. Vance had come with institutional backing, Dale realized, which meant the university had sent him, or at the very least had not told him to stay home. Retired or not, Clifford Vance was here on behalf of something larger than himself, and the university was counting on that to be enough. He came to the front of the crowd and stood for a moment looking at the device, and then at Dale, and his expression was the expression of a man who has decided that the best way to contain a situation is to address it directly and immediately before it develops further momentum. "I need to stop this demonstration," Vance said. His voice was practiced and carried to the edges of the crowd without apparent effort. He had a voice built for auditoriums, for rooms where no one questioned the authority behind the words. This device and its public display constitutes infringement of intellectual property held by the state university. We have issued formal notice to Mr. Mercer, and he has chosen to ignore it. I am here to inform everyone present that this demonstration is not legally sanctioned and that the university will pursue all available remedies. The crowd was very still. Dale looked at Dr. Clifford Vance for a long moment. He had imagined this meeting many times in the preceding weeks, in the kitchen, in the evenings, in the workshop during testing, lying awake in the pre-dawn quiet of the farmhouse. He had imagined it with anger, with nervousness, with the rehearsed arguments of a man preparing his case. Standing here now, looking at the man who had sent 3 letters to Harlan Pruitt in 2008, knowing exactly what they would accomplish, he felt something quieter than anger. He felt clear. He turned to Nora, who was standing near the workshop entrance with her laptop open and the projector ready. She had been prepared for this since they'd discussed the possibility 3 nights earlier. "Can you put up document 6, Dale said. The image appeared on the portable projector screen they'd set up beside the workshop door, large enough for the crowd to read without straining. It was a scan of the first letter from Dr. Clifford Vance to Harlan Pruitt, dated March 2008. The letterhead was legible. The signature at the bottom was legible. The body of the letter, with its professional warmth and its careful threats, was legible to every person standing in that yard. Dale looked back at Vance. "Dr. Vance," he said, "can you explain to everyone here why you wrote personally to Harlan Pruitt in March of 2008, in September of 2008, threatening legal action if he continued pursuing his patent claim, given that the earliest of those letters was sent 1 full year after Harlan first tried to file, and the same year that your university filed their first patent using the same foundational principles?" The crowd was absolutely silent. Vance looked at the screen. Something happened in his face, a rapid sequence of calculation and adjustment, the expression of a man who has been carefully managing his public presentation for decades, and is now running that management process in real time under conditions it was never designed to handle. "Those letters were standard legal correspondence," Vance said. "The university was protecting legitimate intellectual property developed through our own research programs." Dale let the silence after that statement sit for a moment. The crowd felt it, the weight of an answer that addresses the question asked while not touching the question meant. Nora put up document 7, the internal university email from October 2007 between Vance and a colleague in the legal affairs office. The subject line read "Pruitt Correspondence Strategy." The body of the email discussed in the collegial shorthand of two people talking privately how to position the legal letters to Harlan in a way that would discourage his patent pursuit without creating a paper trail that could later be characterized as intimidation. The crowd read it. Someone near the back said something low that Dale couldn't fully hear, but he heard the response it generated, the murmur that moves through people who have just understood something and are reacting to what that understanding means about the world. Vance turned to the lawyer beside him and spoke briefly. Then he looked back at Dale with the expression of a man who is shifting to a different strategy. "This is not the appropriate venue for these allegations," Vance said. "If you have legal claims, pursue them through proper channels. This demonstration is over." He stepped toward the workshop entrance, and Dr. Evelyn Stratton stepped out of it. She had arrived an hour before the demonstration, driven 4 hours from the university city alone, parked at the far end of the driveway, and spent most of the morning in the farmhouse with a cup of coffee and her own thoughts. She had not announced herself to the crowd. She had waited because she had understood instinctively that there was a right moment for what she needed to say, and that forcing that moment would diminish it. She was 61 years old, simply dressed, her gray hair cut short, her face carrying the quality of someone who has been preparing for a long time to say something they should have said years earlier, and has finally found the place where saying it is possible. "Clifford," she said. Vance stopped. He looked at her. Something changed in his face in a way that the crowd couldn't fully read, but that Dale, watching, understood, as the look of a man who has just realized that the thing he didn't account for has arrived. "My name is Dr. Evelyn Stratton," she said, turning to face the crowd. "I am a professor at the State University School of Engineering. I was Harlan Pruitt's collaborator for 4 years. I read everything he built here. I watched him develop these designs in correspondence that I still have copies of. I helped refine some of what you see on those walls. And then I allowed my department to use what he shared with me to build a patent portfolio that shut him out of his own invention." The silence had a different quality now. Not the silence of people that are waiting to hear what comes next, but the silence of people who have heard something and are sitting with the weight of it. "I have spent 15 years telling myself that I was practical," she said, "that this was how the academic world worked, that Harlan couldn't have navigated the system anyway. I told myself those things until I stopped being able to see what I had actually done, which was betray a man who trusted me, who shared his work with me in good faith, and who deserved better from someone who was in a position to give it to him." She paused. The crowd, all 160 of them, was completely still. "What you see in that workshop," she said, "is the work of a genuinely brilliant man, a self-taught engineer who had no institutional backing, no credentials, no platform, and no resources, and who nonetheless built something real and important because he understood a problem clearly and cared enough to solve it. The university's research program that Clifford Vance built his career on is built directly on Harlan Pruitt's foundational work. The patents we hold describe systems derived from his designs. And Harlan Pruitt died in December 2019 without any acknowledgement of what he had contributed because we made certain he couldn't fight back. She looked at Vance. He said nothing. That ends today, Dr. Stratton said. Agnes Whitfield stood up from her folding chair. She moved slowly using her cane, and the crowd shifted to give her space with the instinctive respect that communities sometimes show their oldest members when those members decide to speak. I knew Harlan for 30 years, Agnes said. She didn't project her voice, but the crowd had gone quiet enough that she didn't need to. He helped my husband Carl with metalwork more times than I could count. Never asked for anything in return. Never complained about anything. We thought he was peculiar. Most of us did because we couldn't see what he was doing out here. She looked around at the people gathered in the yard of the farm where Harlan Pruitt had lived and worked and died without recognition. Turns out he was the most serious person in this town, and we just never knew to look. She sat back down. After that, others spoke. The mechanic from the north side of Harlow, who remembered Harlan diagnosing a complex engine failure that 3 other shops had given up on doing it in 20 minutes, refusing payment. The librarian from the county library who recalled him working through engineering textbooks at a back table for years, always polite, returning every book in better condition than he'd found it. Small memories, the kind that accumulate around a life lived quietly in one place, and that the people who hold them don't always know, are worth telling until the right moment arrives and makes the telling necessary. What emerged from those memories was a portrait, not of a strange reclusive man who had wasted his life on an impossible dream, but of a person who had been present in this community in ways the community had consistently failed to register because they had already decided what he was and had never troubled themselves to revise that decision. Drew Calloway from the television station was filming everything. Beth Sherwood's pen had not stopped moving in 20 minutes. 3 other journalists whom Howard Gaines had quietly arranged to be present were recording on their phones. The story that was happening in this yard on a Saturday in November was not a complicated story. It was old and recognizable, the kind that people understand immediately when it is told plainly because they have felt versions of it in their own lives and know exactly what it costs. But it was also specific, and the specificity was what would make it travel. Vance and the men with him left before the demonstration officially concluded. They left without making further statements, the kind of departure that is itself a statement about the options remaining. Howard Gaines watched them go with the measured expression of a man who has seen this calculation made before and knows what it means for what comes next. The formal legal process moved more quickly than Dale had expected because the university did not want it to move slowly. The media coverage in the week following the demonstration was substantial. Beth Sherwood's article ran in the county paper on Monday morning and was picked up by the Associated Press by Monday afternoon. By Tuesday, it was in a dozen regional papers and 3 national technology publications. By Wednesday, Howard's contact at the National Innovation Protection Alliance had connected the story to 2 major outlets covering intellectual property law, and their detailed analyses of the university's patents, alongside Harlan's documented prior art, were landing hard. The university issued its first statement on Tuesday. Careful language. No admission of anything. A suggestion that they were reviewing historical records. Howard read it on the phone with Dale and said simply, "They're scared." Good. The second statement came Friday, more conciliatory, acknowledging that correspondence with Harlan Pruitt had occurred and that some exchange of technical information had taken place, offering to explore appropriate recognition of his contributions. Then in the week before the formal negotiation, something the university had not anticipated arrived from an unexpected direction. Their own internal audit, launched under pressure from the university's board of trustees, who had been reading the same news coverage as everyone else, surfaced a discrepancy in the patent filings. The research timelines in the 2008 patent applications had been adjusted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to a casual reader. A matter of months moved in a direction that created distance between the documented development dates and the period of Harlan's correspondence with Dr. Stratton. It was a small falsification. It was also the kind of falsification that, once found, could not be unfound because it existed in federal records. It was not a patent dispute anymore. It was potentially a federal fraud matter. Howard received a summary of the audit findings from a source inside the university's legal department, someone who had decided apparently that the institution's best chance of surviving this was to cooperate rather than conceal. Howard said nothing about the audit to Dale until he was sitting across the negotiating table from the university's legal team. He wanted them to understand all at once the full scope of what they were facing. Howard's response to the university's second public statement, drafted with Patricia Osgood at the National Innovation Protection Alliance, laid out their demands without ambiguity. Public acknowledgement of Harlan Pruitt as the original inventor of the core technology. Formal written apology from the institution. An endowed scholarship in Harlan's name for engineering students from rural communities fully funded. The removal of any claim against Dale's working prototype or any improvements to the design. Citation of Harlan's foundational work in all future university publications and patents derived from the technology. And the condition that distinguished this from every previous settlement, the university might have imagined all of this to be publicly disclosed with no confidentiality provisions of any kind. The university's legal team called Howard the following Thursday requesting a meeting. They met on a Tuesday in a conference facility in a city equidistant between Harlow and the university, the kind of anonymous corporate space designed for exactly this kind of resolution away from public scrutiny. Dale drove with Nora and Howard. Dr. Stratton drove alone and arrived separately because she had insisted on being present and no one had argued against it. Patricia Osgood participated by video from her organization's offices. The university's team was 4 people, 3 lawyers and a public relations director, which told Dale something about their priorities. There was no Dr. Vance. That told him something too. The absence of the man who had built his career on Harlan's work was its own kind of statement. The institution was already beginning the process of creating distance between itself and him. The university's lead attorney opened with their position, which was substantially less than what Howard had asked for and substantially more than nothing. They were prepared to acknowledge Harlan's contributions, to include appropriate recognition in future publications, to provide a financial settlement to Dale. Howard listened. Then he spoke for 12 minutes without referring to any notes. He described the evidence clearly and in sequence. The dated correspondence, the internal emails, the timeline that placed Harlan's documented development years before the university's filings, Dr. Stratton's willingness to testify in any proceeding, the National Innovation Protection Alliance's readiness to support formal patent challenges to all 3 of the university's relevant filings, the ongoing media coverage that had reached national outlets and showed no sign of diminishing. And then calmly he placed a single document on the table in front of the lead attorney, a summary of the internal audit findings, the adjusted timeline in the 2008 patent applications, the federal implications of falsified records in a patent filing. He concluded by saying that the university could choose to fight this publicly and lose in ways that went well beyond embarrassment, or it could choose to do what was right and say so clearly on the record without conditions designed to soften or obscure what had happened. They took a break for 2 hours. Dale and Nora and Howard and Dr. Stratton sat in a smaller room with bad coffee and the kind of waiting that has moved past nervousness into something quieter and more resolute. Nora looked at her father across the table. "You doing okay?" "I'm thinking about him waiting for answers from people who'd already decided what to do with him," Dale said. 30 years of that, 2 hours is nothing. When the university team called them back, the shift in how they held themselves was visible before anyone spoke. The lead attorney's opening words were different in register from the morning's. They were not conceding in the language of defeat, but they were no longer fighting in any language at all. The negotiation took 3 more hours. Every phrase of the acknowledgement statement was argued over. The scope of the scholarship, the specific language regarding Harlan's role in the foundational research. Dale let Howard and Patricia handle most of it, speaking only twice once, to clarify that the scholarship had to specify rural community students because that was who Harlan had designed the device for, and once to say that the public statement could not use the word contributions when what they meant was invention. The university accepted both points. The final documents were signed at 7:30 in the evening. Outside the conference room windows, the city was dark and lit the mixture of darkness and artificial light that cities wear after nightfall. Dale signed his name with a hand that was steadier than it had probably earned the right to be, and felt the pen's weight and the paper's texture, and thought about Harlan Pruitt signing his name to 3 letters in 2008 that had not been answered, and a patent application that had been rejected, and the journal entries that had grown more tired as the years went by and the time ran out. Dr. Stratton signed as a witness. Her face was the face of someone who has done something that cannot undo what preceded it but matters nonetheless, and who has made peace with that distinction. Driving home through the dark with Nora at the wheel and Howard in the back seat going over the final language one more time. Dale looked out at the highway's edge where the fields began and thought about nothing specific for a long time. Are you glad, Nora asked. I will be, Dale said. When the statement goes out and people see his name where it should have been all along. Right now, I'm mostly just thinking about how long it took. She reached over and covered his hand with hers for a moment without saying anything. He held on briefly before she returned her hand to the wheel. It didn't take too long, she said after a moment. It took exactly as long as it needed someone like you to come along and decide it mattered. The university's public statement, posted online at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, 17 days after the demonstration. The headline read that State University acknowledges Harlan Pruitt as pioneer in independent energy research. Harlan's name appeared 14 times in the body of the statement. The scholarship was detailed, prominently fully endowed, specifically designated for first-generation engineering students from rural communities, the first applications to be accepted in the spring. The acknowledgement of the falsified research timelines was addressed in measured language, but addressed the university was cooperating with a federal review and had initiated its own review of affiliated research programs. Dale read it at the kitchen table with his coffee in the chair where he had first read Harlan's journal on a morning that now felt like it belonged to a different version of himself. Nora sat across from him, watching his face. He read it through twice. Then he set it down and looked out the window at the fields. He'd be amazed, Dale said, that people cared enough to get it right. Because of you, Nora said. You made them care. Dale shook his head slowly. I just read the journal. I just followed what was already there. He left everything anyone needed to understand who he was and what he'd done. He just needed someone to actually read it. The first scholarship recipient was announced 4 months later. Her name was Jody Baxter, 19 years old, from a farming community in the central part of the state. She had taught herself advanced mathematics from textbooks. Her high school library didn't have funding to keep working through problems at the kitchen table after her shifts helping with her family's equipment maintenance. She had applied to 3 engineering programs and been accepted to none of them for reasons that had everything to do with the resources she'd had access to and nothing to do with her ability. The Harlan Pruitt Memorial Scholarship would send her to the university in the fall to study renewable energy systems. Dale met her briefly at the scholarship ceremony held at the university in a room that looked out over the campus's newer buildings, the ones built in the years when the department's grant funding had been flowing steadily on the strength of work Harlan Pruitt had done alone in a barn in Harlow, Wisconsin. Jody Baxter had calloused hands and a direct way of looking at people that reminded Dale of someone, and it took him a moment to understand who. She said, "Thank you for fighting for him. People like us, we need to know that someone who started where we started can still build something that matters." Dale shook her hand and thought about Harlan's journal. Just needs someone who believes enough to put it together. That's all any of us need, really. Someone who believes. He was quiet on the drive back to Harlow. Nora drove the same highway they'd traveled many times in the past months, the flat country opening around them in the way of spring in Wisconsin, everything returning from underneath the fields beginning to show the first green. At their edges, the season making its unhurried case that it had always intended to come back. She said, "You're going to keep the workshop open, aren't you?" "Yes." "Good." He'd already talked to Howard about the licensing arrangements, the agreements with 3 manufacturers who had expressed interest in producing the device for the rural cooperative market that Harlan had always had in mind. The licensing fees would go to 2 places, the scholarship fund and a small foundation that Nora was building methodically and with the focus she brought to everything she decided to actually do to support independent inventors who needed legal protection before the wrong people noticed them. She had resigned from pharmaceutical sales in February and had not looked back in the way of a person who has found what they actually wanted to be doing and is now doing it. Dale watched the change in her with the quiet satisfaction of a father who has waited a long time to see his child stop running and turn towards something instead. The workshop itself had become something he hadn't anticipated. Word had continued to spread after the demonstration in the media coverage, and people came to the farm on rural Route 9 with a frequency that still surprised him. Engineering students making the drive from universities 2 hours away. Journalists writing follow-up pieces on intellectual property reform. Retired men with backgrounds in mechanics and manufacturing who'd heard about a self-taught inventor and felt the specific pull of recognition that comes when a story is about you, even if it isn't about you. Families who'd seen the story somewhere and made a weekend trip of it, filing through the workshop with the quiet attention of people visiting a place that has earned its significance through what actually happened there. Dale gave tours twice a month. He never charged for them. He told the story the same way every time, plainly and in sequence, starting with a man who began in 1995 and ending with a device that worked exactly as designed. He let people look at the blueprints and handle the journal carefully and see the device run. He answered questions for as long as anyone had them, and some people had many. Norm Kettler had promoted him to assistant manager at the hardware store with a meaningful raise. "You're good for business," Norm said with his characteristic directness. "People trust you. Also, you actually know what you're talking about when someone comes in with a complicated repair question." Dale kept the job. It gave him structure and a reason to be in town, and the daily low-level satisfaction of helping people solve problems that were solvable. But his heart lived increasingly at the farm and the workshop, in the ongoing project of documenting Harlan's methods and making them available to anyone who wanted to understand how one man with no credentials and no institutional support had built something that a well-funded university research program couldn't match. On a morning in late April, after a tour group had left and the workshop had returned to its familiar quiet, Dale sat at the main workbench with the journal open to its final pages. He had been adding his own entries since November, a record of what had happened and how documentation in the same spirit Harlan had always brought to the work. Because the record mattered, because the truth needed somewhere permanent to live. He picked up the pen. April 22nd, 6 months since I found this place. Harlan's name is on a scholarship in a laboratory, in an agreement that will be public record for as long as the university exists. His device is moving toward production. The workshop is a place where people come now to understand what one person with enough stubbornness and time can actually build. I came here with nothing. I had lost my mom and my purpose, and most of my sense that any of it mattered. Harlan's work gave me all three back. More than that, it gave me my daughter back. It gave me a reason to be exactly the age I am, in exactly the place I am doing exactly this. To whoever continues this work after I'm gone, honor what came before you. Harlan showed us how. The rest is just showing up. He paused, looked around the workshop, at the blueprints that had been here for 30 years, waiting for someone to read them carefully enough to understand them. At the device humming its steady note in the center of the bench. At the framed photograph of Harlan Pruitt standing beside his early prototype with that slight knowing expression, the face of a man who had done the work and decided that was enough, regardless of whether anyone ever saw it. Dale had thought about that expression many times in the months since he'd first found the photograph in the kitchen drawer. He had tried to understand what it contained. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't the defensive pride of a man who has been dismissed so many times he has armored himself against the world. It was something quieter and more durable than either of those things. It was the expression of a man who knew who he was. Not what the town thought of him. Not what the university had decided he was worth. Not what the form letters and the patent rejections and the professional warmth threats said about his standing in the world. He knew what he had built and why it was good and what it was for. And he had decided somewhere in the 30 years of working alone in this workshop that this knowledge was enough to work from, that it did not require external confirmation to be real. Dale understood that expression now in a way he hadn't understood it 6 months ago. He understood it because he had arrived at something similar himself, not through genius or invention, but through the simpler act of deciding that a dead man's story was worth fighting for, and then fighting for it and discovering in the process that the fighting had given him back something he thought was gone for good. He wrote the last line. "Harlan, they know your name now. They always should have. But you knew who you were the whole time. That was never the part that was missing." He set the pen down and closed the journal. Outside, the April morning was doing what April mornings do in Wisconsin, when they are serious about spring filling the air with the smell of wet earth and new growth. The fields behind the barn already showing green at the edges, where the first things were pushing through the sky, a clear and uncomplicated blue. Dale walked out of the workshop into it. Nora's car was coming up the driveway. He could see it through the gaps in the tree line that had been there since Harlan planted those trees 50 or 60 years ago, before the device, and before the blueprints, and before any of it, when this had simply been land that a man intended to tend carefully for as long as he was given. Dale stood in the yard and watched his daughter's car come up the drive in the spring morning light, and felt in the way that things feel when they have been a long time arriving that he was standing in exactly the right place. Behind him in the workshop, the device hummed its steady note. Harlan Pruitt's name was on a plaque in a university laboratory 3 hours away. It was on a scholarship that would send Jody Baxter and the students who came after her toward the work they were built for. It was in the federal record, public and permanent, in the places where it should have been all along. And it was here where it had always been, in the workshop on rural Route 9 in Harlow, Wisconsin, in the blueprints on the walls and the journal on the shelf and the device that hummed in the morning like a thing that has been waiting a long time to be of use and has finally gotten the chance to prove it was worth waiting for. Dale Mercer had arrived at this farm with nothing. He stood in its yard on an April morning with everything that mattered. Sometimes the worthless prize turns out to be the only thing worth having. Sometimes the man that nobody wanted is exactly the man the work was waiting for. Sometimes justice arrives late and imperfect in wearing the clothes of a county raffle and a hardware store employee discount, and a promise made in the dark to a stranger who will never know it was kept. And sometimes, if you are willing to stay long enough and work carefully enough and believe in what a stranger left behind, the truth finds its way home, even when it has been a very long time coming. Even then,